Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on AI, artificial intelligence. We are very happy to have so many participants also today. More than 150 people have registered. We really look forward to hear the presentations from our very distinguished speakers and also the questions from you. As you know, we always appreciate interaction with our participants. So let's move immediately and recall the housekeeping rules. As you know, there is a small delay due to the web streaming. To ask a question, please use Slido. You have received the link before this meeting. Please indicate to whom this question is addressed and also indicate your name and your organization. So let's now move to the objective of today's meeting, which is really about the latest development in the EU legal framework on artificial intelligence. And here we will get a very interesting presentation from our colleagues from DG Connect, which are responsible for the relevant piece of legislation put forward by the European Commission. We will also see where innovation procurement meets artificial intelligence. There is a very strong convergence between these two topics. And also we will see, and this is a very important step, let's say the development of the EU standard clauses for buying artificial intelligence, building up from the standard clauses that Amsterdam had developed first in Europe. Today's meeting is divided in 4 different parts. The first part will be about, as I indicated earlier, from our colleagues of DG Connect, and also one colleague from Eurocities. The colleagues from DG Connect will will explain the state of play of the EU legal framework on AI and also on the coordinated plan. Lodwijk Noordzee from Eurocities also will introduce a very important initiatives they are working on. We will then follow a very interesting presentation from Keegan McBride, from the Hertie School of Berlin, from the Center of Digital Governance. He has carried out a very interesting research on the challenges of procuring AI in the public sector. We will then move to the third part, which is about the development of the clauses for the purchase of artificial intelligence. And here we will have the support of Jeroen Naves from from Peltz Reiken law firm, and Lindia Prinsen, program manager, CTO Amsterdam. So this will be the follow-up, let's say, in that respect of our earlier webinar, which took place last year. Finally, our colleague Noerin Ni Erkan and Anita Port from DG Connect and DG Grow will do a call for the collective development of these clauses through the creation of a community of practice. And then finally, we will also have the space for interaction with you with the questions. So without any further ado, I will pass the floor to our colleagues. So Jordanka Ivanova, which is in the unit which is responsible for the policy and development of artificial intelligence and for the legal framework. And then she will pass the floor directly to Noerin, who will explain about the action plan. Noerin works in the unit which is responsible for technologies for smart communities, and clearly there is a very close link to public procurement in this respect, because we can see how this can improve the life of citizens by offering digital services. And then Noerin will allow Lodwijk for a very short intervention about his initiative. So Jordanka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I'm very happy to be here today with you to present you the latest developments and the European Commission artificial approach to artificial intelligence. First, to start, we think this is artificial intelligence is a very important technology, which is key for our technological sovereignty, for the preservation of the public interest, and especially also for public authorities as it can also bring a lot of benefits of better, most cost-effective services that are also more accessible to citizens. And here you see that over the past 3 years, we have implemented a number of initiatives that have led to the recent package on artificial intelligence, which was adopted by the Commission last year. And it includes two main deliverables. This is the coordinated plan on artificial intelligence, which is a review from 2018, and also the first proposal for a regulation of artificial intelligence, which is very important because it also will apply to public authorities and it sets our objectives. So these two actions aim to achieve our twin objectives. On one hand, really to support the uptake and the development of artificial intelligence technologies across all industry and also the public authorities. And on the other hand, also to deal with the particular risks and challenges that these technologies can raise because of their specific characteristics, and also to ensure that when they are used by users, public authorities, or private entities, they ensure compliance with our fundamental rights and also European values. This is very important, and this is at the basis of our trustworthy and human-centric approach to artificial intelligence. So first, with the coordinated plan, very quickly, as mentioned, this is a joint initiative between the Commission and the Member States, and it aims to achieve our first objective to create the ecosystem of excellence with a lot of actions, more than 70, very concrete steps how we plan to achieve this ecosystem and make Europe a hub for trustworthy AI in general. And this includes support for measures such as data spaces, also increased computing capacities, collaborations between public and private partners, research, testing and experimentation facilities, skills and talent, which is key for any user, but also for Europe to start to develop its own capacity to develop and use that key technology, and also specific actions to focus on very high impact sectors. And here you see in the last column that actually the public sector is identified as the key sector where we see a lot of need for support, concrete support measures, and specific programs to support public authorities to uptake, including through measures like the contractual clauses we are going to discuss today, but also many more linked and inspired on best practices. And my colleague Noreen will talk more about this. Now I'll focus more actually on the legal framework because, as mentioned, the second very important deliverable of this package is the first proposal for a regulation on artificial intelligence, which was put forward in April and which is now currently under discussion. So this proposal aims to be like the single European Union law for artificial intelligence in all 27 EU member states. And it sets harmonized rules how these technologies should be placed on the market, in the European market, and also used with the objective to ensure that we create this common single market for trustworthy AI in Europe. And we also address the specific risks to safety and fundamental rights that I mentioned before. It is very important that these rules are harmonized, they are uniform and horizontal for all EU member states, but also for all sectors. And they will apply both to public and private operators. So this could cover including the development of in-house development, for example, of artificial intelligence technologies by public authorities. So in that case, they would be like providers of those systems, but also if they are just users procuring those systems from the market from other private operators. And this will create a level playing field. This is also very important, and will also apply to actors and providers, technology providers, either if they are based outside the European Union when they want to place their systems on the European market. The legislation is consistent with already existing legal frameworks like the General Data Protection Regulation, product safety obligations, and it actually aims to complement and only fill gaps for those frameworks with specific design internal market requirements for the way that those systems are actually designed and developed. So we address the specific risks and challenges for artificial intelligence technology. We aim to create innovation-friendly rules that give legal certainty to both providers and users, how they can deal with these novel technologies, because we've seen in our assessment that there is a great legal uncertainty in the moment, how actually specific risks like opacity, bias, complexity, or autonomy of those systems can be dealt with and addressed. And by giving specific technical solutions and requirements how this can happen, we also aim to stimulate and build trust in the market, that those technologies are properly assessed and certified, and they can be safely used, including by public authorities, but also private operators in their daily activities. It is also very important for our approach that we want to avoid over-regulation, because this is a novel technology. It is fast changing. We want to create rules that are sufficiently clear and also proportionate, and that they intervene only where this is strictly necessary. And for this, it is very important that we follow the risk-based approach, which does not aim to regulate AI in general, but really focuses on the specific use cases and applications, because the risks to fundamental rights and safety are very specific depending on the specific context, and we think we need proportionate rules to deal with those applications. So here you see our risk pyramid, and it shows on the bottom the green layer, where we have assessed that the majority of the existing applications we think would pose minimal or no risks to fundamental rights or safety. And for that, we think that we don't need additional rules on the top of what we already have as safeguards, guarantees in existing national and union legislation. So these systems will be permitted without further requirements. But organizations could choose to adhere to voluntary codes of conduct, where they could follow these good practices, for example, tailored also to the specific use cases, if they wish to do so. And we actually encourage them, but this remains purely voluntary. On the next level, you see the yellow category, where we identify certain applications where we see specific risk of manipulation because of the increased capabilities of artificial intelligence, like chatbots and other applications, to mislead users that they are interacting with humans. So we think that people should always be informed if they're interacting with AI, or also if other specific applications or outputs like deep fakes that can mislead people to believe that these are real people showed on images or videos. We should always be informed, so we know that this is artificially generated or manipulated content. On the top, on the next level, you see the orange category, which is actually the core of our proposal, because here, with those systems that we have specifically identified as posing high risks to fundamental rights, health and safety, we propose to apply specific requirements for trustworthy AI to ensure that those systems, before they can be placed on the market or used in Europe, they comply with essential requirements I'm going to talk about more. And they undergo specific conformity assessment procedures and ex post monitoring. So we really address those risks with appropriate safeguards. And on the top, you see the red category where we've identified a limited number of AI applications which we propose to prohibit. These are only for specific practices, including social general purpose social scoring by public authorities or real-time remote biometric identification for law enforcement purposes, which we think that these are incompatible with our values and they should be prohibited outright. But here it's very important to go back to the orange category because this is most relevant for the seminar today, as these requirements that I mentioned and conformity assessment procedure for high-risk AI systems will impose also obviously new obligations for public authorities if they decide to develop those systems in-house or if they decide as users to procure them also from the market. So here we have tried to really focus our regulatory intervention and identified already the specific use cases in the regulation. We have two main categories, which include AI systems, which are safety components of regulated products like medical devices, machinery, toys, for which the requirements will be fully integrated in the existing conformity assessment procedures, also that apply to the relevant product safety legislation. And also in our Annex 3, we propose certain standalone AI systems that are not yet regulated, but for first time we propose to apply the same requirements in specific use cases listed in this 8 areas: biometric identification, categorization, critical infrastructure, education, vocational training, employment and workers management. And here it's very important also this category of access to enjoyment of essential private as well as public services, law enforcement, migration, asylum, border control management, and administration of justice and democratic processes. You see that actually here, to the extent that we have public authorities, you would also have to comply with the same requirements and procedures if you decide to develop those systems in-house, or you would be able to rely on the specific certification system we propose if you procure them from the market. Our objective is to remain proportionate, so we have specifically listed the use cases we propose now to cover. For example, for the public authorities in this category, which covers the essential public services and benefits, this includes, for now, AI systems intended to be used by public authorities or on their behalf to evaluate the eligibility of natural persons for public assistance, benefits and services, as well as to grant, revoke, or reclaim such benefits and services. There are also specific use cases that we might find in the other broad areas like migration or law enforcement. So depending on the specific sector of the public authority, it could look and see whether actually it's already included with specific application in one of those areas, and whether it would have to undergo and comply mandatory with these requirements. And here you see in this slide actually what we expect and these essential requirements which we have proposed for those high-risk AI systems. They are very much based on the best practices existing so far include obligations to establish risk management processes to ensure good quality data when those systems are developed and tested, to provide specific documentation and logging capabilities to allow the traceability and auditability of those systems, to provide appropriate degree of transparency and also specific information that should be given to the users from the provider, so they are sufficiently equipped to use, to know the capabilities, limitations of the systems, and to use them appropriately, to enable human oversight measures that can be built into the system, and also with specific measures that should be implemented by the users, as well as to ensure robustness, accuracy, and cybersecurity. And following the product safety approach, we also propose to create harmonized technical European standards to help organizations demonstrate compliance with these requirements. It's important that actually the obligation to ensure compliance with these requirements now with the legislation is placed mainly on those who are developing and supplying those systems. So in case public authorities use procurement procedures and external suppliers, it's very important then to integrate these requirements and obligations for the supplier, who should ensure compliance with the requirements and undergo relevant conformity assessment procedures. And we have also proposed that he should undergo some post-market monitoring activities and also register those systems in an EU-wide database when they are listed in Annex 3. On the other hand, public organizations would be mainly responsible for the operation of the system as users. If they are just procuring those systems from the market, they'll have to exercise the human oversight, follow the instructions, and monitor the operation for the possible risks. They will also have to automatically automatically generated logs and inform the provider if there are serious incidents or malfunctioning, so he can take appropriate corrective actions. And these obligations aim to really give also lighter approach to public organizations when they procure the system from the market, because they should be able to rely on the certification that is already done by the suppliers following their obligation and established conformity assessment procedures that can be integrated into these standard contractual clauses we're going to discuss later on. And these obligations, is also important to emphasize, they apply also on the top of what already exists as obligations in the data protection legislation or public administrative law. We have also specific actions to encourage innovation with regulatory sandboxes that can also allow public authorities to develop and to use systems with support and under the supervision of the competent authorities, and also specific measures to support SMEs and startups who could be procuring and supplying those systems to the market, to private organizations, or also public authorities. And here you see a snapshot of the governance and enforcement structure, mainly with enforcement at national level and coordination and implementation forum with the European Artificial Intelligence Board to ensure effective and uniform implementation also at EU level. Finally, it's important to mention that this legislation is not yet adopted. This is still a proposal. It is now discussed by the European Parliament and the Council. We have a lot of ongoing discussions and amendments proposed. We hope that both co-legislators can reach agreement next year, and we can have a finalized text, so some of the obligations and the requirements could also be changed along that process. After it's adopted in the end, we'll have a 2 years of transitional period before the regulation becomes applicable. And during that time, we also plan to work on these harmonized technical standards that are going to be proposed by the European Standardization Organization, and that will help us private suppliers, but also public organizations if they want to develop in-house those systems to demonstrate compliance with these new requirements and conformity assessment procedures. And with this, I stop and just want to highlight the very high level relevance of this proposal with the ongoing discussions for the procurement clauses, because we think that even if it's not yet an adopted legislation, it is very important to align already the requirements and already to start a discussion with the community about the possible implementation or even testing of similar requirements and the needs also of the public authorities when they want to procure those systems in compliance with the new legislation for the future. And now I will give back the floor to Norit, who will say more about the other broader actions that we put forward at European level, how we aim to support public authorities in the uptake of AI.
Thank you very much, Jordanka. Can you hear me, everyone? Yes. My colleagues in the room say they can hear me. Sorry, I'll just remove this thing. So I'm from DG Connect, from a unit called Technologies for Smart Communities. And of course, as Ivo mentioned, AI is one of these technologies that local and regional administrations are using in order to develop better services for citizens. So we're very interested and we're very supportive of this work by DG Grow. And during my presentation, I'll present to you an initiative that we're working on with cities, communities, regions, and even member states called Living in EU, which is contributing to the uptake of AI at local and regional level. So a short bit of context. So obviously the European Green Deal and Europe Fit for the Digital Age are headline priorities for the Commission, and cities are and communities are really at the heart of trying to implement the twin digital and green transition. And there are many targets set for member states with the digital compass for the European digital decade up until 2030, and obviously all levels of government will need to be part of this effort if we are to achieve these goals. So the Living in EU community has a vision for, and indeed DG Connect has a vision for how the digital transformation at local level works. So very briefly, you have connectivity infrastructure in the bottom layer here. We will be supporting the creation of a data space which will help for the sharing of data for cities and communities, and indeed any level of government, with the public and private sector across different domains such as transport and energy, etc., to help with the implementation of the Green Deal. And delivery of AI, of course, depends on having access to data. Then the middle layer here are local data platforms, which many cities and communities are implementing. And a local data platform allows a city or any administrative level to integrate data from different sources, and then to be able to use this data to deliver AI-based services, which is the top layer in this diagram. And what we are working towards is, in fact, a very advanced version of AI, which is local digital twins, which we will be supporting through the Digital Europe programme. So what are local digital twins? Basically, they are a virtual replica of a city or a part of a city or even a member state or a region. And they use modelling and AI to predict outcomes in the longer term and help for planning and policy decisions. And they can also be used in the short term for operational decisions across different areas and integrating different sectors, such as, for example, air pollution, mobility, waste management, water management, in a holistic way. So there are some examples on the screen of cities working on digital twins, including some European funded projects. So what is Living in EU? Living in EU is a group of cities, member states and regions, at the moment 117, and we hope you will, if you're not already a member, that you become one. Basically, we're all working together to advance the digital transformation based on a certain set of principles which are in the Living in EU declaration. And this is a political declaration. And those principles are listed here, but basically it's about open innovation, using open standards and involving citizens. And we work across a number of different working groups, technical, legal, education and capacity building, monitoring and measuring, and financial. And we are working on some aspects of the AI coordinated plan. So I will briefly present. The AI coordinated plan was mentioned by Jordanka earlier. There's a chapter in the coordinated plan on public sector AI, and some of these initiatives are being delivered either through Living in EU or through partners that work with Living in EU, such as Eurocities. So Lodewijk will speak also on what we're doing. So the AI coordinated plan says that we will support communities to procure trustworthy AI by developing these procurement clauses, which is the subject of today's webinar. And then the second thing and the third thing are, well, number two there is AI algorithm registries. And Lodewijk will speak about that shortly. Basically, an algorithmic registry is an online tool where a citizen can check how an AI or an algorithmic system has been used in a way that may affect them. And there are examples that are already existing in Amsterdam and Helsinki. And then there are a number of other initiatives underway, and one of these is a catalogue of AI applications, and one of those is funded also under the Digital Europe programme, and it's AI, the Adopt AI platform, if I hopefully said it correctly, which is AI for EU, and I'll put the link in the chat. So just to very briefly outline the three things mentioned that we're working on. So firstly, the subject of today's webinar with DG Grow about the contractual clauses that were developed by Amsterdam. Then the second thing, the AI registry. So Lodewijk will explain what work is going on with Eurocities, which will hopefully be of benefit to any level of public administration and will support them by basically setting out a template of what is required to develop an AI registry. And then thirdly, Living in EU, supported by OASC, an organisation called Open and Agile Smart Cities. They are working to develop a set of technical requirements that would automate the link between the procurement clauses and an AI registry. So it's on the technical side of things, and work is being done through Living in EU. So if you want to find out more, I invite you to join the movement. And just to briefly mention the plethora of different initiatives that are underway to support public services, public administrations to use AI. So, for example, I'll just mention very briefly AI Watch, which is a series of studies done by the JRC, which are worth looking at. AI for EU, there is the AI Adopt AI platform. The AI on-demand platform. So I realise I said the wrong thing earlier. So the AI for EU is basically going to be a catalogue of AI that other public administrations can use to, they can reuse and they can find out what others are doing. Then the Adopt AI programme is being done within DG Connect, and it's a study again on adoption of AI. The network of European digital innovation hubs will shortly be up and running, and that will be a support for public administrations as well as private companies that want to adopt AI. And then there are 2 projects on the left, AI for cities and DT for regions, which are 2 important projects on AI. So if you're interested, you can check them out. And lastly, a little plug for Living in the EU again, and I will hand over to Lodewijk.
Thank you very much, Noreen. Am I audible, visible?
That's perfect. Go on.
Thank you very much. I'm aware that we're running a little bit tight on time, so I'll try and keep it short. My name is Lodewijk Noordzij, and I work as a policy officer with Eurocities. Eurocities is a European network of European cities, larger European cities, and we have over 200 members currently. Within Eurocities, we work in different forums that cover different domains, and I'm part of the digital forum, where we cover all things digital, so to say. And within the digital forum, well, we also work together with Living in You, which was mentioned by Noreen. We're one of the founding partners there as well. And within the digital forum, we work we have a lab format, and in the lab format, we try to reuse and upskill good practices from European cities in the digital realm, so to say. And it was mentioned before that Amsterdam and Helsinki currently operate algorithm registries, which provide a transparency and an accountability tool for cities and citizens to improve the safe and ethical use of algorithms in the public domain. This is also why we're focusing with the Digital Forum Lab on algorithm registries. And this is also why it's relevant for the topic and the webinar here at hand, where it says AI public procurement for building trust with citizens and businesses, of course. For the lab, we're going to focus, as you can see here, where we illustrate the scope of the project on the data schema. On the left-hand side, you see the contract clauses, which are ways of obtaining information or safeguarding the access to information on algorithms that are in use by services and software that have been procured by a party. On the right side, you see algorithm registries, which are a transparency tool, which need information on algorithms to be able to provide the information to the public. But in between, there is actually something that should be bringing these things together. The data schema is actually an input for algorithm registries, but you could say that it's an output for the contract clauses, because if we know what information we get or what information we should have on algorithms, we also need to make sure that we have a common technical but also semantic representation of the data. This is where the data schema comes in. It provides a way for the technical people to translate information into a public registry that is, for example, visible and accessible on the internet, but it also provides a tool for policymakers or for civil servants, for example, to capture the data that they've received or that they're collecting on algorithms in a document that is usable by the technical parties. So for the coming 6 months, we will be working with 9 cities on this data schema that is derived from the data schema already in place, already in use by Amsterdam and Helsinki. The results, the outcomes, the first outcomes after 6 months will then be further developed through the Living in EU network, where more cities can understand how it's a tool that's useful for them, but also to further improve and elaborate upon it according to the needs of their local contexts. And I'm very happy that I was able to share this here because I think it's a great way of putting all the efforts that we're undertaking together. Thank you very much. I think I'm supposed to give the floor back to Anita Poort again, if I'm correct.
Thanks, Ludwig. I'll take back the floor, and I now invite Keegan McBride to go ahead with the program and to present the outcome of his research paper on the challenges of procuring AI for the public sector. Clearly, if you want to diffuse further AI and have a correct use of AI, it's very important to look at also what are the challenges and the difficulties. And Keegan McBride is a postdoctoral researcher at Hertie School in Berlin, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I assume that you can hear me and you can see my slides. All is okay, yes?
Fine, go ahead.
Okay, I can see my slides. Cool. So thank you very much for having me today. I'm here to talk about a research paper we recently conducted called Towards a Systematic Understanding on the Challenges of Procuring Artificial Intelligence in the Public Sector. So basically, I will provide a short introduction for the study, talk a little bit about the background, the goals of the research, the methodology that we used for the study, the findings, and then offer some final thoughts. And sorry, 1 second here. So I wanted to start off with this quote, which I think sort of encapsulates why we thought this study was important. It was co-authored with Gianluca Mitoraka, who used to be at the JRC, Colin Van Noort, who's doing quite a lot for AI Watch, and with Gerhard Hammerschmidt, who's a professor at the Hertie School and director of the Center for Digital Governance. But I think this quote just really sums up why procurement is important, especially when we're talking about AI. Getting procurement rules right is one of the most important parts of driving improvements in technology, and that it is a huge part of driving digital as a whole, including the take-up of AI. And this came from the House of Lords Select Committee on Artificial Intelligence in the UK back from 2017, but it still holds true. Procurement is very important. And when it comes to the use of AI in the public sector, this is also increasing. There are a number of benefits associated with AI, but there's a ton of potential consequences. We also know that a lot of the in-house competence isn't there when it comes to AI. And what does that mean? There's a whole lot of procurement. So in order to minimize the risks associated with the use of AI in the public sector, to maximize the gains, smart, targeted, and well-developed procurement methods, strategies, and guidelines are needed. And while many governments do have experience with procurement, the procurement of AI systems is not necessarily the same. So with this thinking in mind, we started looking at the literature to understand, what can we already learn about why procurements fail? And if we're talking about procurement more generally, of course, there are these, common findings related to contract management capacity, being able to understand and formulate technical requirements, having knowledge of the market, the timing of the procurement, the organization's technical competence, broader organizational competencies. And if you look at literature on procurement of AI, you see similar things, but also a few things that, are a bit different. For example, related to data ownership, data usage and algorithms, data sovereignty, bias and discrimination, responsibility, trade secrecy, and intellectual property rights. And so this sort of framed this research for us as, we know that governments have a lot of experience with procurement. We think artificial intelligence and the procurement of artificial intelligence is, perhaps a bit different than what governments maybe have experience with. We're not exactly sure, but we wanted to find out. So with our research, we had two goals, really. The first was explore the challenges encountered during the procurement of AI in the public sector. And the second was to understand potential proposed solutions and approaches for overcoming or preventing these challenges. Another quote here, which I found quite interesting, also to sort of, frame this and how we were approaching it. This comes from Mulligan and Baumberger and Berkeley Tech Law Journal from 2019. And they were referring to another study by Robert Braunes and Ellen Goodman. And I've bolded the more important parts here, but they sent out Freedom of Information Act requests on 6 algorithmic programs in use by 42 different agencies in 23 states. And only one jurisdiction was able to provide the algorithm and details about its development. In pretty much all instances, they did not have access to the algorithm, the model's design, or the process through which the algorithm was generated or adjusted. This is something that procurement can help with, right? So how did we, go about approaching this study? Well, what we started with was trying to understand in which countries there were strategies and guidelines in place already to sort of procure AI or to offer advice or help with the procurement of AI. And from this, we found 4 countries, so Estonia, the Netherlands, Serbia, and the United Kingdom. And from there, we did interviews within each country, and we looked at a bunch of documents, the Estonian AI strategy, the sort of AI procurement in a box, which was put together between the UK and the World Bank, and the Serbia has their AI strategy, and then we looked at the standard clauses, which came from Amsterdam, which are also being talked about in today's webinar. In Estonia, they have a whole bunch of management material and guidelines and templates, training and YouTube series. So we just tried to take this sort of broader approach, looking at what guidelines and documents were actually out there. And then we, had this understanding about how they were trying to improve the procurement of AI within their respective country. And what wasn't especially clear from the documents, we went more in depth into the interviews with people directly involved in creating these strategies or guidelines, or directly involved with the procurement of AI in the public sector. And so the rest of the slides basically go over the findings and potential sort of solutions to the challenges we identified. So the first challenges we found were related to the procurement process. So the first challenge is related to market knowledge. The second was related to trade secrecy. The third to service needs. And the fourth was related to structure. And in the right column, what you see are the solutions that were identified within these guidelines and strategies. So we know that these are the challenges. How can we try to sort of overcome them? So, for example, related to market knowledge, engaging in market research to understand the state of the art and whether or not a specific project is feasible. Trade secrecy, including specific regulations within the procurement on trade secrecy and intellectual property rights, ensuring that proper documentation is provided and mandated in procurement documents. This could, for example, have information related to standard clauses when it comes to trade secrecy or intellectual property rights. Structure, creating a standard procurement template to ensure consistency and validity of AI procurements. In Estonia, they actually have a really nice template, which you can just go through and you fill in your information, and then you have a really well-structured, basically template for procuring an artificial intelligence solution. The second group of challenges were those related to data. So data availability, data ownership, data governance, and data infrastructure. And here, the solutions that came out from the research are, for example, creating a data availability assessment prior to the procurement process, making sure that you actually have the data available by ensuring data access, storage, and consent before the procurement, but you can actually make it available. Data infrastructure, making sure that you actually have the sort of relevant infrastructure. Data ownership, ensuring that the procurement has specific language that data provided by the public administration or collected in the context of procurement remains with the administration. This is a case in Serbia where when they're procuring an AI system, they basically have standard language which says that the associated data has to be, let's say assigned to or given to the public sector. Then the third group of challenges were those related to the AI model themselves. So AI system quality, AI transparency, AI bias. And here you will see solutions such as, conducting a data assessment to identify and address data bias, having a checklist to go through to make sure that you're able to identify and mitigate risks, requiring clear documentation about the functionality of the AI system, the data used, how it works. This is at a minimum. And this goes back to the quote I showed earlier. We need to actually understand what these systems are and how they're working. And I should also mention that I'm being a bit brief here, just in the essence of time. And this paper is available, and it goes a bit more into detail on all of these things. And in the question and answer period, I'm more than happy also to go a bit more into depth of any specific challenge or solution. And the final group of challenges were those related to the organization and the organizational capacity. And so here you have challenges related to, technical capacity, organizational capacity, individual capacities, and solutions. How can you overcome this? For example, individual capacities encourages participation in and arrange educational courses on AI. Earlier, I saw that AI for EU was mentioned. There they have a course catalog, for example. There are also courses like Elements of AI, which was started in Finland, but which is spread all over Europe. These are, sort of rudimentary courses that allow people and public servants to get familiar with artificial intelligence at a very basic level, but it helps to understand how AI works and, what can be done, what can't be done, so on and so forth. Similarly, when it comes to technical capacity, experts in the organization to develop an initial understanding on AI. Similarly here, also educational courses on the organizational capacity, also, sharing information between different organizations, what has gone well, what has not gone well, providing guidance and best practices for AI procurement, template, sample procurement, so on and so forth. And wrapping this all up, let's say, in the sort of final thoughts and the final results of the research, we know that procurement of AI systems in the public sector does have some uniquely associated challenges when compared to, traditional technological procurement. This means that we're going to have to learn a bit about how to actually procure AI in the public sector better. in our research, in our study, we identified 14 commonly occurring or identified challenges within these 4 broader categories related to the procurement process, data, AI model, and organizational capacity. Of these 14 identified challenges, 22 potential strategies for overcoming them emerge from the research, from the different guidelines and strategies that have already been created and implemented. And I should also mention here that these are just strategies, right? The research itself doesn't necessarily mean that these 100% will work, but this is just what has been proposed, this is what has been written, and this is the sort of steps and approaches that these countries are taking to try to overcome these challenges. And this is not only important for the public sector, but clear procurement guidelines are better for everyone. As a private sector actor, it's also important to understand what the government is actually trying to procure. I have seen in my capacity as a researcher many procurements fail because, let's say, the public sector provider doesn't actually understand what they can do with their data, or the private sector actor doesn't actually understand what the government is asking for. So having better guidelines helps everybody because it makes procurement more clear and it makes it more effective and more efficient. And then this brings us to the sort of future research, which is still needed. All of these countries actually have different understanding of what is and is not AI. More clarification on this is needed. Are these guidelines actually useful in overcoming challenges? How does context influence the procurement of AI? How can we develop the necessary organizational capacities to better procure AI? So there's definitely a lot of future opportunities for research. And I really do think that this is an important area for research, which so far hasn't been given enough attention. And with that, I would just like to conclude with how our paper concludes, which is, it is certain that AI is here to stay in the public sector, and that procurement will play an increasingly important role in the adoption of AI amongst public sector organizations. And this raises both the prominence and the need for scholars and experts to conduct research on this emerging area of inquiry. And so I'm very happy to hear that there's some 150 registrations for this event, because it really shows how important this topic is and how interesting it is. And so with that, I would say thank you, and I would end my slideshow now, and then hand back control over to, I think, Anita. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Keegan, for your excellent presentation. It really brings a lot of food for thought in terms of what are the possible challenges and also the possible way to address and overcome them. And also, I also like a lot your call for future research in this team, in this area, which is certainly much needed. I would now pass the floor to Jeroen Naves, which is an IT lawyer at Pels Reiskin in The Hague, to present his work on the clauses, which is now aligned to the AI framework. I have to say Jeroen is a regular speaker now in this webinar. He's a kind of usual suspect because he was also in our first webinar. And also he's also accompanied by Lydia Prinsen, which is program manager at the CTO in Amsterdam, and who will briefly explain us the starting point of the contractual terms. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Good morning all. I hope you can hear me. Before Jeroen shall share with you in more detail the latest version of the drafted standard clauses for the procurement of artificial intelligence, I, as a representative of the City of Amsterdam, would like to provide more information regarding the history of origin. Amsterdam is known as a city of canals and bicycles, but is also a technically minded city. Amsterdam believes and aims to use technology in a secure and responsible manner. This belief is reflected by having a people-centered approach towards technology. An approach which is reflected by having a Councillor for Digital Affairs and a policy framework named the Digital City Agenda. This framework aims for democratic safeguards for citizens online as well as offline. To have grip on our technology, and based on this mindset, the city has developed an algorithm policy which includes the 4 instruments that the previous speakers already referred to and can be seen in the left column. And this is the so-called Amsterdam Lifecycle Algorithm approach. In order of being transparent and able to explain to our citizens which algorithms the city uses, how an algorithm works and which data it uses, It's of great importance to have access to that information in the first place. The algorithms used by Amsterdam are developed by our own technical experts, or in most cases by other parties. We therefore started drawing up contractual terms for the procurement of algorithms. This framework for the information that suppliers need to provide to the city was the starting point of the current drafted standard clauses for the procurement of AI. By receiving this information about an algorithm, Amsterdam believes being able to assess the quality and the risks without the supplier having to submit company confidential information. The following 3 components, which can be seen in the right column, stated in the current version of the contractual terms, have formed the basis for the new version. So first of all, the technical transparency. This offers insight into the technical operation of the algorithm. Technical transparency is usually not necessary unless in the event of an audit or when needed for explainability. The procedural transparency. This helps to understand the purpose of the algorithm and how it arrives at its outcome. It enables us to establish whether the appropriate measures have been taken to safeguard the quality and reduces the risks. Finally, the explainability. Stricter rules will apply if the outcome of an algorithm affects someone personally. The supplier must cooperate to make the algorithm's decision-making transparent at an individual level. This gives citizens the opportunity to lodge an objection against a decision or outcome. And Jeroen Naves shall now inform us about the latest version. So Jeroen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lydia. Well, great to be here. Thanks for all the interesting presentations of the other speakers. Last year, I gave during this webinar, I gave a workshop on the AI clauses we created for the city of Amsterdam. Well, when we created those clauses in 2017 and 2018, there wasn't an AI Act yet proposed. So what we then did was create, well, we were actually the first to create contractual standards or contractual clauses based on the, well, all the guidelines that were available during that time. Well, we've not been sitting still since then. Since the beginning of this year, we are working on, like the other speakers already more or less announced, on a second draft of the AI clauses, which will hopefully transform the coming years into a European standard for procurement of AI. These clauses are created based on the Amsterdam AI clauses, so we focus on public organizations, but I can imagine that, well, if they are at a certain moment reflecting the best practices available in the market, that they can also be used by other users or buyers of artificial intelligence systems. The document we are creating, it's not an official EU document, but it's, well, it's a first step towards creating a best practice in the field on contracting on AI. Well, we have a few minutes left, so during the coming minutes, I want to share the outlines of the new version of the clauses after this webinar. I think by the end of the week or maybe the beginning of next week, we will share this document with all the visitors of the webinar, so you can have a more in-depth look at it. It's important to notice that the Amsterdam clauses, which are already available online, both in Dutch and English, so you can look them up and have a look at them, already contain important topics in the field of contracting on AI, which are still relevant today. I refer to the topics listed in my slide: risk management, data quality, transparency, data ownership, audits, etc. Some of these topics are also included in the proposed AI Act. For example, risk management, data quality, transparency, and other topics are more not included in the AI Act because they are mainly relevant in a contractual relationship, for example, data ownership and audits. And the reason for that is, of course, that the AI Act or the draft that is currently available seeks to regulate the market. Contractual clauses are trying to regulate a contractual relationship between a buyer and a seller of an AI system. So why is it nevertheless wise to align in a contractual relationship as much as possible with the contractual terms of the AI Act, even since the AI Act is still subject to ongoing negotiations and it's just not final. The text will change probably during the coming years. Well, like Jordanka already explained, the AI Act contains best practices in the field of the regulation of AI. So the obligations and requirements of the AI Act are at least not all yet law, but they are, of course, very important at this moment as well, and are, well, a great standard to be used, especially by public organizations buying AI systems at this moment. And they are, of course, they are to a certain extent based on, well, among others, the advice of the high-level expert group on AI as well. So they include best practices in the field of the regulation of AI, and why trying to create a new best practice if there's already a regulatory framework proposed that probably will become law at a certain moment. So that's the reason why we decided to, or the main reason to align the contractual clauses as much as possible with the proposed AI Act. And of course, by using obligations of the proposed AI Act in contractual clauses, you more or less anticipate on the AI Act. So by the time that the AI Act will enter into force, well, there's a good chance that you are already compliant to a certain extent. So to summarize, what did we do in the new version of the AI clauses? We used the best practices out of the Amsterdam AI clauses and certain obligations out of the AI Act, and well, mixed them together and created a new version of the standard clauses. To zoom in a bit more on the topics, we included in the new version of the contractual clauses. As I already explained, we reused the topics out of the Amsterdam clauses, which are not included in the AI Act. So, for example, data ownership, audits, transparency, which is of course part of the proposed AI Act as well, which is also quite intensely regulated in the Amsterdam clauses as well, and aligned, for example, with the obligations of the algorithm register already other speakers told you about. We replaced certain topics were already arranged in the Amsterdam clauses and the AI Act as well, and we replaced those clauses by the clauses out of the AI Act, and we added topics which were not already included in the Amsterdam clauses, for example, record keeping and human oversight in the new version of the contractual clauses. So what we now have is a new version of the contractual clauses, best practices of Amsterdam, data ownership, audits, IP rights, for example. We added the requirements for high-risk AI systems and the obligations of the supplier of high-risk AI systems, and we created, well, what I said, a new version of the contractual clauses. And what we also did is, of course, try to align as much as possible with the definitions of the proposed AI Act. We, for example, also introduced the Amsterdam clauses mainly focus on well, algorithmic systems which do to a certain extent impact civilians of the city of Amsterdam. In a new version of the clauses, we decided to focus to reuse the definition of AI system of the proposed AI Act. But there's also, and that's of course that's of course easy if you use certain obligations and requirements into contractual terms. There's of course also always the possibility to extend the scope of the clauses. So I also introduced the option to extend the clauses, the scope of the clauses to other systems, which by the definition of the of AI system under the AI Act do not fall within the scope of the clauses. Which it's of course important to notice that the document we will share after this webinar includes a lot of obligations and requirements. Well, whether all these requirements and obligations are sufficient and proportionate for a particular AI system is of course always the buyer of the AI system always need to assess. And we mainly focused on the requirements and obligations for high-risk AI systems. You can, of course, ask yourself the question whether all these requirements are, well, sufficient and proportionate if you are buying a system which does not qualify as a high-risk system within the meaning of the AI. So that's, of course, always an assessment the buyer of the AI system has to make. But the AI clauses are written from the perspective, okay, we include all possible clauses, and the user of the clauses has to decide whether all clauses are relevant in a specific situation. And well, as Jordanka already explained, from a perspective of the European Commission, it's of course very important that well, all clauses or all parts of the AI Act are already used also in the current situation, or at least as much as possible. For example, of course, there isn't a European database yet available, so we of course didn't introduce the obligation to register a high-risk AI system in a European database. But on the other hand, we created the option to use information which can be part of a register of the municipality or other public organization who is buying the AI system. Well, as I already said, the first draft of the new version of the clauses will be shared soon. It's important to know that this is still work in process. It's a living document. The document will be updated, especially, of course, when there's a new version of the AI Act available. But we're also welcoming comments and suggestions, and really looking forward to input from all of you. And I can imagine that within a few months we publish a new version, which will be changed based on your comments and suggestions. So that was my presentation. I hope we're not running too much out of time. Give the floor back, I think, to Anita or Ivo, I think.
Many thanks, Jeroen. Many thanks, Lydia. It was very, very clear, and we have really very much welcomed the evolution of the Amsterdam clauses. I will now pass the floor to Anita, which will present us a very important call for collective development regarding AI and public procurement.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm Anita Poort from C2, Public Procurement. I work closely together with my colleague from Connect, Noreen, on this topic. From the speakers of today, we can all understand that there is a lot of work to be done on the topic of public procurement of AI. Some things are in progress, but we definitely need to work together, share knowledge, and maybe also develop joint action. Can I have the next slide, please? So I would like you to inform you from my side that our unit and department is working on a digital big public buyers community, which can host communities of practice and stimulate information exchange on the topic of public procurement. And of course, after today, there can be no other conclusion that there should be a community of practice on public procurement of AI. We would like to start this community of practice with working together on the AI clauses. And of course, we work closely together with the Living in EU as they work on the AI registries and the FAIR MIM. We work also together closely with DG Connect, as Norin already mentioned, the several projects they are running closely also related to the topic of public procurement. So the planning of the platform, we actually, the picture you saw is a bit outdated. It's already progressed, and we are currently designing the platform, hopefully to be launched in February 2023. The platform will be live for at least 4 years. If it's successful, there will be a decision to continue it or not. But as it's not yet launched, and it will be soon, we would like to call you together to work through the website of Living in EU, because we will be working closely with this project anyway, as the interrelationships with the IE registries and the FAIR MIM are very tight. And so from next week on, or at least we hope so, the clauses that are developed now by Jeroen and the City of Amsterdam together with us will be launched from this link. Of course, we will publish this link just shortly after the webinar, but it's on the Living in EU website. Within a week, you can download the clauses, and you can also leave your contact details in the box. If you do that, you will be contacted to work together with us on this community of practice. And the first product we would like to work together on is then the development of these IE clauses. And we need your feedback from all kinds of stakeholders. So please visit then that website and let us know if you want to work with us. We need volunteers and preferably from all kinds of layers in the public administrations, from society, and also, of course, the AI service providers. So this was my call, and I give back the floor to my colleague Ivo.
Many thanks, Anita. Many thanks, Anita. I think this is a very important and relevant development in order to continue the work on this area. And indeed, the contribution of all parties involved can be very, very helpful, especially also for building this community of practice that Anita mentioned earlier. And now it's time to take the questions which have from the audience. We have received a number of questions, and it's time to interact with the audience and also with our speakers. The first question is addressed to Jordanka, but I leave the floor to my colleague Anna Lupi to read them.
Thank you, Ivo. So the first question is for Jordanka, and it comes from Professor Albert Sanchez-Grez from the University of Bristol. Is it possible to provide some update on the progress of development of the Adopt AI program?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. So this is, as you know, a specific program that is envisaged in the coordinated plan we mentioned, and it is specifically targeting public authorities. Now, the program itself really aims to give all necessary services and support to public authorities to uptake artificial intelligence technologies in their daily activities. So it is very ambitious, but before the program actually starts to operate, what we envisaged in the Commission is to do a preliminary study with sectoral dialogues with public authorities to identify the concrete needs, possible actions, and we are now actually in process of doing this preliminary study with the contractor. It has not yet started, but it is already, we are engaging in the selection of the contractor, and then the specific deliverables are expected, and the activities of this preliminary study is expected later this year. So we will also share relevant information also in the community mentioned by Anita for any results coming out from this, as well as the Living EU platform mentioned by Noreen.
Thank you, Jordanka. We have another question from you, still from Professor Sanchez-Grels. Has the principle of administrative autonomy, self-organization, played any role in the classification of almost all public sector uses as minimal or no risk to leave them to voluntary compliance with codes of conduct domestically?
Well, it's been indeed in my proposal, I mentioned that now we have this broad category, which is the essential public services. We have also specific sectors like migration, law enforcement, where we could, or justice, which are again public authorities, and we could have their more sectoral specific use cases. I think in the identification of the specific use cases, we try to use criteria that so we have a common approach, how we determine the significant impact on citizens' rights. We used a number of criteria that are already listed in our proposal in Article 7, which are the significant expected adverse impacts on people, on citizens, on their fundamental rights, as well as the available evidence for this, the state of uptake of those technologies, because we don't want to add high-risk use cases for areas that are purely hypothetical, or we are not yet reaching that stage, the level of vulnerability or the irreversibility of the harm if something wrong happens with this technology. So all these criteria are listed in Article 7. We have not considered specifically this administrative autonomy principle, but I think in our approach was really to try to distinguish some really significant applications for the public authorities from just any AI that can support administrative, purely internal tasks without any actual consequences for people and for businesses if public authorities take decisions. So that's why we were, I could say, in our first proposal, a bit more targeted in the high-risk use cases. But as mentioned by me, and in the green category, that does not mean that public authorities actually could not apply also similar requirements and procedures if they see the need also to go beyond a bit those use cases and just implement similar good practices in documentation, in procuring AI in general. But indeed, then it's more up to them to do that on a voluntary basis, and also to take into account, obviously, the stringency or the proportionality. Maybe not all requirements, or at least not as detailed as they are placed now in the regulation, could be relevant in all cases. So we try to be proportionate and focused, but also encourage public authorities to use similar good practices and requirements in their broader activities.
Thank you, Jordanka. Next, we have a question for Jeroen. Still from Professor Sanchez-Graels, who asks, is there a way of classifying the standard clauses depending on the level of risk? For example, through annexes indicating suggested combinations for different uses. Otherwise, they may end up being only used in high-risk cases.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting and good question. Jordanka already answered the question a little bit. In the AI clauses, we took the proposed AI Act as a starting point, which, well, mainly focuses on high-risk AI systems. So the clauses also take, well, high-risk AI systems as a starting point. In the clauses, what we try to do is, well, mention, try to write down which clauses optional in a situation where it's a low-risk AI system. It's, of course, a bit arbitrary because, well, if you look to the AI Act, of course, all clauses are, or all requirements are optional if it's not a high-risk AI system. But we try to, well, to distinguish, to make a sort of distinguishment between important requirements and super important requirements. But I can imagine that, well, as we said, this is a living document, that a next step will be to work this a bit more out and maybe, as you are suggesting, create some kind of annex or explanation in which we can, well, in more detail write down when to use which articles.
Thank you.
At least a very important question and a topic we are aware of the importance.
Thank you very much, Jeroen. Now a question for all the panelists from Professor Georgopoulos from the University of Nottingham. Are the initiatives in the EU keeping an eye on the developments of AI regulation in China? I don't know who wants to go first, but please.
Maybe I give it a first try. So indeed, we are very much following international developments. We see that Europe and the European Commission was one of the first regulators worldwide to come up with so specific, comprehensive proposal for artificial intelligence, but similar initiatives, maybe not so much cross-sectoral or horizontal, but more specific for specific type of applications or sectors are emerging also in other countries, or at least being discussed. So we have very intense dialogues also with international partners, US, India, Japan, and we also, including with China, we monitor very well recent developments, because you're right that actually China is posing itself as one of the other very active regulators, because most of the others are taking more voluntary or monitoring approach what's happening, or trying to come up with international frameworks in OECD, Council of Europe, where Europe also cooperate, while China has its own perspective. We follow that. They came up with proposals closely to our one in terms of timing, but it is indeed a bit different from our approach. They focus a lot on regulation of specific types of applications or operators, players like platforms. We also have in Europe specific legislation for platform like the Digital Service Act, but I'm also aware that recently they also proposed a very concrete application for the so-called generative AI systems, where businesses have very, very strong obligations also to register, do prior risk assessment checks. So it is also something we closely follow, and we can see how certainly it's international level. We need that dialogue to ensure that we have at least for operators acting in different areas, we have some common understanding of the challenges. And hopefully also one day we have a more consistent also international approach. That's why we follow very closely also the AI definition of OECD, for example, because we certainly see this as an emerging regulatory issue globally, not only in Europe.
Thank you very much, Jordanka. I don't know if anyone else wants to intervene on this question. If not, we can move to the next one, which is also a bit for all of you, but I think maybe first for Keegan, if he wants to reply. It's kind of a provocative question from Marc Delcourt, who asks, it seems that the entire control system relies on a self-registration and a declaration on honor. Do AI systems have honor?
I think this was probably more directed towards Noreen or the earlier presentations. It's a bit out of scope from something that I personally have worked on. So.
Okay. I don't know if Noreen or Jordanka want to.
If I look at the slide, this was asked when they were talking about the algorithmic register and these different sorts of things.
I'm not sure exactly what the question referred to, but yes, I suppose in the sense that that Amsterdam set up an AI algorithmic register. Maybe I don't know if Lydia wanted to speak about it, but I mean, at that point there was no AI Act, so it is a point of honour. It's a point of public administration's trying to demonstrate with transparency how AI is being used so that citizens can have confidence that decisions are reached in a fair way and that any use of AI is properly documented and they can find out exactly what has happened behind the scenes, and that is the purpose of it from a good public administration perspective. So indeed it is in a way a point of honour. Then we will have an additional legal layer now with the AI Act, which talks about high-risk AI, but indeed some of it is actually about low-risk AI as well, and just being open and transparent and accountable to citizens. I hope that helps somewhat.
I mean, from my side, what I can also just say is, in regard to the second question here, do AI systems have honor? I mean, I'm highly I'm often citing Joanna Bryson, who's the professor for ethics and technology at Hertie School Center for Digital Governance, where I am, and basically no, AI has what they're programmed to do. But would I say that they have honor? No, I think that's a simple answer to that.
The reason why we're talking about contractual terms is that, of course, that a contract is a way to make a certain obligations or requirements which are not yet law, a contractual obligation, and make them enforceable in a contractual relationship.
Thank you for all your replies. We have, I think, one final question, which is addressed to all of you. To what degree do current clauses cover the topics of fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics of AI? Are there still things that need to be done in the near future? Who wants to go first?
So the current Amsterdam clauses, well, they include more or less all the topics mentioned in the question. But I think all of them are also part of the proposed AI Act as well. So what we did in the, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but what we did in the new version of the clauses that we well, included, replaced the clauses on these topics by, well, parts of the AI Act and made contractual obligations of them. So I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but we, yes, these topics are, as long as they are enforceable, because of course a topic like ethics of AI is very broad, but Jordanka can explain a bit more how AI ethics are part of the AI Act. But what we tried to do is create a system of risk management to ensure that when creating or selling an AI system, all possible risks in the field of ethical risk, but I can imagine also other risks are taken into account in a good way. So I think this is more or less an answer to the first question. Are there still things that need to be done in the near future? I'm not so sure, but of course the clauses are, as I explained, a living document, so certain topics will be addressed more or less. But I think the AI Act will, we will more or less follow the revolution or the evolution of the proposed AI Act.
Thank you, Jeroen. Yeah, please, Jordanka.
I just want to say exactly that indeed, as said by Jeroen, fairness, accountability, transparency, they are the basis of the requirements that have been proposed for those high-risk AI systems. And we very much also encourage their compliance, even for risks that might not be, or for use cases that might not be now qualified as high risk. But public administration want to apply voluntarily. And as mentioned now, actually the discussion is still very much ongoing with the Parliament. Is this list sufficiently robust? Should more use cases be added? Also, should we need more ethical and other broader requirements than those we have proposed, even for all AI systems, or covering also specific dimensions that we have now left more for voluntary application, for example, like social and environmental impact of AI applications, where we don't have this mandatory check, or accessibility, but we certainly promote them through codes of conduct. So there are changes certainly expected already during this negotiation process, and we do agree that what we propose now, because we are also now experiencing and also as citizens, and we're learning a lot for the impacts, for the risks that might emerge. So we also don't see this proposal and the regulation as something that is now the end. And certainly when we are dealing with so fast developing technologies, we've tried to embed these mechanisms already to give more powers to keep it future-proof. And also we'll need, of course, then once it becomes more and more implemented in Europe, to keep it also regularly monitored, evaluated. So AI, I think, will raise a lot of new challenges in any case. And it is our first attempt, I think, also with the AI Act to deal with them.
So many thanks to everybody. Thanks really very much for your participation. Also, let me thank our speakers for their very interesting presentation, which have showed very different dimensions of this very relevant issue. I really hope that you have found it useful, and as usual, our webinar will be available on our YouTube channel, the YouTube channel of DG Grow. Also, I want to thank the speakers for having been so diligent regarding timekeeping, because we had a very, very dense agenda, and we are just slightly over time. So just 2 seconds to promote our next webinars, the master classes on how to price the value of innovation in an innovation partnership, which will take place on 31st of May, 7th of June, and 21st of June. Only 30 places will be available. Then we will have also other events. Of course, the conclusion of our cycle of webinars on the guidance on social procurement, and this will be devoted to working conditions and will take place on the 16th of June. It will be a lunchtime talk, as all the webinars which are part of this cycle. Then there are also other initiatives, for example, this very relevant one, which is launched by our colleagues from the EIC, which is the second edition of the European Innovation Procurement Awards, and the deadline for submission is open until the 22nd of June. The winner for each category will be awarded 75,000 euros, and the runner-up 25,000 euros. And there are 3 categories. All the details are available, of course, in the relevant page in the website. And also we have another webinar coming on the 21st of June, which is about our Green Public Procurement Help Desk. And this is also very interesting, and it's about how to use innovation partnership in the social sector, a very important webinar again. And I think that with this, we can just share our information details, our functional mailbox, you know, our LinkedIn group, Agents of Innovation Procurement, our website, and I think that with this, I can close this webinar, and many thanks again.